Hi, my name is Samson Kasumba, and this is the Focal Point. I'll do something I've never done here and give you 22 seconds to introduce yourself.
I'm Julius Kapwepwe. I'm Director of Programs at Uganda Debt Network.
Fantastic. Julius, let's get into this. What's the tune of our indebtedness?
Different institutions have different figures, precisely. Bank of Uganda has a different figure from Ministry of Finance. The International Monetary Fund has a different figure. To that extent, Uganda Debt Network sees that we already at over 49.9% of the otherwise globally agreed debt GDP threshold.
Okay. You talked about 4 or 5 institutions that have different figures. Are all those figures correct?
Broadly, we see that the different institutions, including government, certainly, mainly focus on what we call DOD, disbursed and outstanding debt.
Okay.
In other words, you are going for new money, but you already had previously gone for some other money. Therefore, this is coming to add on to the existing, disbursed and outstanding. In the case of Uganda Debt Network, we are being courageous, face government and those mighty institutions, and say, hello, how about the level of domestic areas?
Okay.
Service providers need to be paid, so are those providers of goods to government.
Okay.
To level of trillions. Look at land compensations, which are still outstanding in trillions on the debt on the public debt.
Okay.
Look at
Government payouts are also
yes,
in their trillions.
guarantees. Yes, look at the number of guarantees to private entities and individuals. So those are some of the different contingent liabilities. If you look at compensations that have been awarded to people in instances of abuse of human rights, like in the case of police, and in billions of shillings. So all that constitutes public debt.
Are we at the point where we genuinely should start to be worried about the size of our debt?
We are not against borrowing, we are for responsible borrowing. This far, we have had cases where debt resources have simply been abused. We think we need to first put a halt and then clean up our house, get projects feasibility in time, and then you can borrow when you know what you are borrowing for and exactly how much.
Who are we indebted to the most?
Uganda, in terms of bilateral donors, we are mostly indebted to China.
Should we worry?
Similarly, Africa, on bilateral loans, is indebted highly to China. And yes, we should worry. Therefore, the multilateral levels, Uganda is mainly indebted to African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the International Monetary Fund, mainly recently because of the COVID situation, the World Bank, and many others. But also at bilateral loans, we owe money to the Austrians, to the Chinese, we talked about them, to the Germans, to the Belgians, to a whole cocktail of people. The catch-22 bit is that now from hitherto concessional loans, we have gone to commercial loans, where you have private and syndicated companies, private lenders, coming and lending to African economies, including Uganda, at very, very high levels of interest. And that causes a bit of discomfort.
Around 95, 96, 2005, I think, and thereabouts, debt was written off.
Yes.
These huge debts were written off. How did we get back to being indebted? Is there what you could say a reckless approach to managing money and borrowing that got us here?
Because of the need on ground for infrastructure, yes, they're going back to, you have seen handsomely where government has borrowed from the World Bank to expand and upgrade health center 2s to health center 3s across the country. That is welcome. But in some of the cases, there has been reckless borrowing. If you looked at PG Kampala Expressway, we borrowed monies when we are not ready. And for about 2 or so years, we are already doing the debt servicing, even when not even a hole was on ground. Gladly, when we talked about it and alerted the powers that be, they are now a bit of wheelbarrows on the ground.
Okay. Are these infrastructure developments for which we are borrowing commercially viable?
There is a whole political economy of development financing, including borrowing. We may not have the time to go into the depth, but that's the kind of the context. In the case of Uganda, if you looked at Rukunjiri, Kanungu road through Chihihi, where we have borrowed through from the African Development Bank to open up that part of the country. You have wind tourism attractions, Queen Elizabeth, and you could see a benefit, tea growing, coffee growing in that part of Uganda. If you looked at Soroti, Moroto Road as a case, Napak, Moroto Road as a case, brand new,
minerals.
new tarmac. If you consciously link that to the industrial park prospects in Moroto and tourism potential and prospects at Kidepo National Park, advertising and kind of synergizing projects, then you could say it is good borrowing. If you looked at the case of Jinja through Tirinyi going to Mbare Road as a case, where you just see dry cassava on the road, I think there is a missing link. So you need an integrated kind of approach to development. When you borrow for that kind of infrastructure, you should have attendant investments into agriculture, for instance, productive and production capacities in the Busoga areas so that you can utilize that kind of facility. So in some of the cases, the politics lead the way, then the economics follow. Ideally, the two should kind of balance in our African context.
COVID is here. Economies are shrinking. The president has said that our shilling is gaining, and rightly so.
Yeah.
But people are not working, people are laying off. It's going to be difficult days. Aren't we seeing on the horizon more borrowing? But if we are going to borrow, from where are we going to borrow, where there is no struggling?
Ideally, it is debatable that Uganda's shilling gaining in the current circumstances is good. There are those who have argued that actually the reason is because of the subdued economic functions. For instance, people don't need the dollars to do the importation, or even the goods are not attracting dollars exports into the economy because the exports have shrunk.
Yes.
Therefore, the low demand and the kind of gaining of the shilling appears artificial. That's the first instance, which could be debated on another occasion. But also, when you look at the current financial year as a case, you have got 45.6 trillion budget. We think in the foregoing, you need to scale that down. The hitherto ambition, when the budget was passed, is no longer tenable. When you look at what should have been the sources of financing, otherwise you are going to resort to even more borrowing. In fact, even if you shrunk the budget now, say to 40 trillion shillings, you will still have to go to borrow. Therefore, in the foregoing, I think we need to look more square on how do we reduce wastage in public spending so that then we can divert that money into other critical areas of need in the health sector, in the agricultural sector, rather than simply go for borrowing. Even domestically, we see that government will still run to borrowing when you look at the huge fiscal deficit that currently stands at about 7%. So we think, yes, it will happen, but overall you need a budget reconfiguration so that you can kind of manage your level of borrowing.
Should debt repayment and the size of our debt be a huge feature in political manifestos?
It has to be that political leader who shows us the promised land, the land to Canaan, if I could use that analogy, on how are you going to lessen the tax burden on you and me, the Ugandan, where we part with that money. Even when we have squeezed it out of ourselves, we are simply working for the Germans and the World Bank owners. So somebody who shows light in terms of lessening the tax burden, lessening the burden that is being bestowed onto the country because of continuous, in some of the cases, unnecessary borrowing. Somebody who shows us the growth dividend that we can generate domestically as Ugandans by investing more locally, by mobilizing the local resources that are available, by fighting and challenging corruption, by taking these dubious guys to jail. Chigo is open. We have even opened new prisons. That kind of political leader is the one we look up to.
Has COVID complicated our debt situation, or is it a blessing in disguise?
COVID is both ways. In some of the cases, it has prompted us, Ugandans, if I take an example of His Excellency President Museveni, to check where can we do differently and better as a country. He has talked about the real economy versus the vulnerable economy. The real investment in real economy generates quicker and better dividend to a citizen, you and I, compared to simply relying on foreign money. The other bit is that we have reached a challenge, because if I take an example of International Monetary Fund, Uganda had graduated away from borrowing through the windows of IMF. Given COVID, we have had to go back with the begging bowl, and now we are on their loan portfolio of those whom we are indebted to. So in that situation, that becomes a bad situation. In cases where we need to check our health care laxity hitherto, and the need now to invest more into health care for Ugandans. That's a good thing that has been prompted by COVID.
Okay. To such a borrower, reckless borrower, does forgiving them debt help?
In the case of Uganda, we have borrowed the money that was forgiven in 1996. Part of that money was used to invest into introducing universal primary education. Banaba Some, four pupils to school.
Which is also controversial.
Which we expanded to Bonaba Some. Every child, every able person, a young person to school.
Has that translated into
that
quality?
That means that you needed to expand the financial bracket. Now, has that resulted into the expected dividend? That's a question that we can debate. Arguably, yes, in terms of literacy levels. Others have said no, because we have not get the literacy translated into income productivity and GDP growth for this country.
But you see, we invested so much money in universal primary education,
yes,
only to find out that when they get out of school, they are not skilled. Now we need to find money to skill them.
Yes, and that part of that money into second phase does not necessarily have to come through borrowing. If you have invested in a road, in energy, and you are able to sell electricity to Rwanda, you are able to sell electricity to roofing's industrial complex as a case, you are generating more money as a country. So you have created capacity and need to continue to create sufficient capacity to generate your own revenues, now which you can invest into the skilling and reprogramming some of these areas that we have worked on. So overall, the borrowing, I think, has been useful. In some of the cases, it has simply been swindled.
Okay, generally speaking, has it been useful?
On the overall scale, borrowing was inevitable and has been useful. Looking at where we were 10 years ago and now, we need to check on the scale of borrowing. We need to massively shrink the scale of borrowing, especially domestic external borrowing.
Okay.
And going forward also, we need to continue investing into our own growth areas so that we can generate our own money and become the lenders rather than the continuous borrowers, as we've seen.
The same borrower we are talking about, other than borrowing from the banks, has also started borrowing from the children in his own house. Because what we do know is government is also borrowing locally, besides not paying suppliers, meaning that that's also borrowed money. Will we stop borrowing at all?
We have been precise and concise to government: stop the creeping habit of borrowing from the domestic market. We don't have the details to go into that, but overall, it causes a whole macroeconomic and microeconomic distortion of your own economy. So borrow elsewhere, bring money from somewhere into your country. Don't eat the little that already is here. Number two, you must be gentle enough and face the issue of domestic arrears. You must pay companies that have supplied you goods and services locally. We've said that private sector is the engine of growth. You must seriously look at the health being of that engine if you want your car to take you to the next level.
Okay. Julius Kapwepe from Uganda Debt Network. Until next time, it's been myself and Mr. Chitimbo on camera for a change. We'll look for another guest and return with a focal point.